Hello and welcome to this episode of Altitude. I'm your host, Russell Porter, and today we'll be discussing the National Police Air Service use of uncrewed aircraft. Giving us the inside story is David Walters from the police, and David is joined by Ed Clay from the Civil Aviation Authority and Richard Ellis from NATS. Hello, David, Ed and Richard.
Afternoon, Russell. Good to see you.
Hi, Russell.
Welcome to the show. Before we get started with our panel, just a quick word for those of you watching live. Please do place any questions into the chat and we'll do our very best to get to them quickly. So with that said, let's turn to David for some introductions.
Hi, Russell. Thank you. So my name is David Walters. I'm Head of Futures and Innovation for the National Police Service. I am responsible for the uncrewed aircraft project that we are running. And the initiative is around testing and evaluating sensors that could support us in the future with a blended fleet capability between crewed and uncrewed aircraft. And looking forward to sharing some of our trials and testing plans.
Thank you, David, and welcome back to Altitude. It's not your first time on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Ed, would you like to make an introduction, please?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ed Clay. I'm Head of Technical Strategy at the UK CAA. So the team is responsible for looking at emerging new technologies, major new technologies, and considering how the CAA is going to effectively regulate those technologies and developing the plan to make that transition. So a lot of focus on UAS, but we also do work on hydrogen, eVTOL, AI, etc. I've been at the CAA for about 18 months. Before that, I was at industry. So I was in the UAS industry. I was ops director at Flylogics, who do BVLOS operations out to oil and gas fields in the North Sea. And then also at a Juno, who help industry adopt drones.
Ed, it's great to have you on the show. I know it's your first time, so welcome to Altitude. And someone whose first time it is not, Richard, I think this is your third time perhaps. So welcome back to the show. Great to see you. Would you like to say hello?
Yeah, thanks, Russell. So my name's Richard Ellis. I'm the New Airspace Users Director for NATS Services. I joined in late 2023 to create a new profit and loss centre with a global responsibility for bringing commercial capabilities to enable uncrewed operations safely in conjunction with traditional airspace users. I've been in the new airspace users industry for about 7 years and really enjoying the challenge of overcoming some of the complexity that I think we all face to get these kind of capabilities operational.
Great stuff. Thanks, Richard. And we'll talk about some of that complexity as we go through the show. So, David, this is your story. Perhaps we'll start with you then for an opening question. It's been described as one of the most ambitious drone trials in the UK. Can you tell us exactly what you are up to?
Yeah, sure. So we're currently operating the Shield S100, as you can see behind me, to allow us to carry several types of payloads that we're evaluating on how we might be able to adopt uncrewed aircraft in the future. One of those payloads specifically will enable us, we hope, to integrate into airspace and operate in the same airspaces as we do currently with our crewed aircraft. Obviously, there are many challenges that come with that, but on the front of the aircraft, you can see behind me, just on the nose, is an active radar, and that is something we've been evaluating for the last 12 months. We did some ground-based testing around that, and now we're moving to the airborne environment and capturing some really valuable data around that. Secondly, we have a MX-10 payload camera, which is equivocal to what we operate existing on our crewed aircraft. So there's an element of how do we integrate into future airspace with other users, but also an element of how can this serve policing like we currently do with our existing crewed aircraft. And then another piece of technology that we've integrated and currently testing and evaluating at the moment is onboard VHF. This hasn't been done in the UK to this extent, is my understanding at the moment, especially with the Shield platform. And I'm trying to essentially replicate what a pilot would be doing in a helicopter. So I have VHF for comms, I have radar for sense and avoid, and then I have the camera payload then for what would be our tactical flight officer, trying to identify suspects, etc. And we're trying to essentially digitize that environment, and that's what we're testing and evaluating throughout the rest of the trial.
Thanks, David. In your introduction, you talked about a blended fleet, and there you spoke about kind of integration with other aircraft. What does that look like from the police perspective?
So we currently operate 19 rotary aircraft and 4 fixed wing, and the fleet itself has just been renewed by several new aircraft coming online over the next 3 or 4 years. But there's an initiative from the Home Office about how can we provide police aviation in a greener way, but also how can we adopt technologies. And this is kind of what this project is also about. We only burn 10 litres of fuel, and we reduce 90% less emissions than our EC135. Our EC135 helicopter will burn up to 200 litres an hour, and obviously the subsequent CO2 emissions that kind of come with that. But we see in the future that we essentially have a toolbox with a suite of tools. We have a fixed wing capability that can deliver a 6-hour capability. We have our EC135 helicopters that are very, very fast, very, very dynamic in flight, and will give you around about a 2-hour flight window. And then we're looking at the uncrewed aircraft capabilities of where we can then do that longer endurance, you know, those 8-hour type sorties, which we currently haven't been able to do before. And along with that comes the complexities around human factors, crew management, because when you have crews and they're used to flying between 2 to 6 hours, and now there's the potential of an 8-hour flight, what does that look like? So we're really kind of just scratching the surface at the moment from an operational perspective, but we see in the future that we will be able to provide a variety of different capabilities to support frontline policing.
Thanks, David. So you're in the trial. How much flying have you been able to do so far?
Yeah, so I think so far in the last 4 or 5 weeks, we've racked up about 30 hours of flying. The longest point-to-point flight that we've done is about 32 kilometers, because that's the length from our takeoff point to the top of our TDA. Total length of our longest flight was about 150 kilometers. That's when we were testing the primary and secondary radar coverage from Cardiff, which was successful, which I'm pleased to say. And that sortie took us for about 3.5 hours. So we are trying to understand like the limits of the capability, and also the endurance side of things as well. How is it operating in various different wind conditions? But then also, how do the sensors perform in those sorts of environments as well?
I understand you're spending quite a lot of time down at the test site as well.
Yes, yeah, I am. Hence here today, but good backdrop for the podcast, so why not?
Yeah, it's excellent. I think at some point maybe I'll ask you to take a stroll over and introduce us to the Shield aircraft. But
yeah, sure.
In the meantime, I'm going to turn to Ed. Thank you very much for the introduction there, David. It was perfect. Ed, the CAA Sandbox, it's an important means to accelerate the introduction of drones, uncrewed aircraft in the UK. Exactly how does a sandbox work?
Yeah, so the phrase comes from computing. The idea is to have an area of a computing system where you can make changes and try new things that won't impact the overall operational system, and we've borrowed it. So many of you will be aware that the UK's ambition, and David's touched on this, is to integrate UAS. We don't want to end up with segregated bits of airspace where UAS are operating. We believe there's not the space in the UK to do that long term, so we want to move towards integration, and we're very aware we can't do that in one step. We've got to take steps to get there, and there's lots of technology. David's touched on some of it. Technology, also procedures that need to be proven and demonstrated to make that transition. So that's where the sandboxes come in. So they're dedicated operations, locations, often bits of airspace with entry conditions, where there are new innovative operations happening, and that's giving industry the chance to learn, but crucially the CAA the chance to learn with industry, and also gather data on these new this new type of operations. So we'll be working really closely with David's team on detect and avoid data, etc., to make sure we've got an understanding of the operations, and then we can use this to sort of move forward and allow more people to do this.
Thanks, Ed. And what was it about the National Police Air Service that enabled them to be selected for this particular trial?
Yeah, so we identified the need. We did, we made that decision that we wanted to have these projects, and we then ran an open competition. So we actually ended up doing 2 calls for that competition. And as you'd expect, we had a scoring criteria. So there were things in there about the capability of the operator, relationship with ANSP, where they wanted to operate, surveillance coverage, all of those sort of things that we were looking for that we felt were important for these operations and would allow the operation to be successful and us to learn what we wanted. So NPAS, like the other applicants, were scored against that and were successful in the project. I think the other thing is it's a big focus of ours to enable emergency service use of UAS. It's something we see as really important. You can see that in the government missions. So it's the emergency services use is also a big focus to us. So NPAS got a sort of double tick in related to that.
Thanks, Ed. So Richard, you've been waiting patiently. NATS, the UK's leading air navigation service provider. How are you helping with the NPAS trial?
Well, I'm glad to pick up on Ed's comment there that relationship with an ANSP was a critical part of the criteria. We're fortunate enough to be supporting 6 out of the 7 selected Sandbox trials in the second tranche of Sandboxes that went out there. But fundamentally, our role is more than just the ANSP aspect of it, but we fundamentally started by creating a segregated airspace in the 7 estuary where David's sat right now. And that was a temporary danger area, or TDA as it's been referred to. And we had to start with this because that's the sort of simplest construct we can work with to get the flight operations underway quickly. And then what we then do is provide a service to NPAS for the temporary danger area to enable them to operate in there. But we also provide a service to other airspace users who might need to access or cross that airspace. So we do that from our Cardiff Air Traffic Control Unit, which provides a safe operational envelope for David and the team there to run the trials. And now we're moving that concept further on, working with the CAA and NPAS to create a more integrated airspace where it's something called a temporary reserved area, or TRA, which will allow us to much more dynamically manage that airspace and enable all users to safely coexist. So quite a lot of aspects to that. Sounds nice and simple, not so simple in practice, but our role is very much about creating the safe airspace environment for the operations to take place.
Thanks, Richard. David, Richard's explained their NATS role. Who else do you need to work with to ensure that this trial is a success?
I think primarily the other airspace stakeholders. I think they are an important stakeholder, although they are not part of our project. They are one of the most primary stakeholders and partners that we have to manage and work with, obviously outside of the realms of the day-to-day programme, but the airspace change processes that we've been through with the regulator for the TDA and the TRA has required a significant amount of manpower and resource to work through. And that's predominantly why we chose to operate at night, to reduce the impact to other airspace stakeholders. It costs me a lot more money and keeps me awake a lot of night. But from us operating then from 10 p.m. till 4 a.m. as our operational window meant that our impact on other airspace stakeholders were as minimal as possible. And it still allows us to conduct and evaluate some of our testing that we need to do. And then as we move forward towards the TRA, as Richard mentioned, that's where we then have the ability then to integrate and allow other traffic that meet the requirements for the TRA into the airspace. So I think those stakeholders are really, really critical to us, and us working closely with the general aviation within the area, as well as the military who fly within the airspace as well around when we're operating. But then we've got partners, obviously, as well as Shield, who are providing the aircraft and the flight crew, who we work with very closely. They've done a lot of work around the integration and testing of the hardware that we've got on this aircraft. It's a configuration they've never flown before, and hence we spent the first 4 or 5 weeks shakedown testing and evaluating the hardware. And then we're also thankfully to be supported by Avonmouth Port, who have allowed us to utilise their helipad for the next 6 months. Obviously, trying to find somewhere to operate that could replicate our NPAS base. It's not the easiest thing to do. And if anyone ever comes to visit, you will literally see I've built a mini heli base where we're operating from. So yeah, really important stakeholders. But I think for me, apart from the ones we've mentioned, the stakeholders, the general aviation ones, are sometimes the ones that gets overlooked, but for us, they're a really important stakeholder that we're conscious of.
David, you've obviously spent a lot of time and invested in this. How long will the trial run for?
So the trial is currently been running for about 4 or 5 weeks, and our hope is it will run up till early December. So we hope the TRA will be coming online sometime around mid-October. We're just waiting for the airspace change process to go through with the regulator. And included in that, we have a window of 10 days where we will conduct some daytime flying. And again, allow us to test and evaluate payloads and things like that. But the majority of the flying will be nighttime based.
Thanks, David. I'm dying to ask you about the Shield, but I'm slightly conscious that you're not wearing a mic, so we'll perhaps have to see how that goes. But before we come to that, we've had a question from our audience. So Tony's asked a really nice question. He said, if the NPAS trial of the Shield S100 is deemed successful, what would be the anticipated timeline for operational deployment over an urban development?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. So the Shield S100, for the purposes of this trial, is a means to an end, i.e. it will carry the payloads that we're looking to test. Unfortunately, Shield do not have a twin engine capability planned on their roadmap. So again, just to be clear, we're not necessarily evaluating the S100 as an aircraft. It's more so the sensors that it's carrying for the purposes of the trial. As we move forward, there are a couple of manufacturers who are developing twin-engine rotary platforms. One, I am aware, is going to be going through the certified process in a European country next year. I don't want to name any manufacturers' names because it might impact my procurement process in the future. But there are a couple of aircraft manufacturers that are building twin-engine capabilities, and that would be a minimum requirement for us, obviously, for operating over urban air environments. Same as our crewed aircraft, our EC-135s operate twin-engine. So we need to have that redundancy and assurance that we can operate safely over there. Timeline-wise, 2030 is when we would like to be in a position where we can start deploying a blended fleet capability of crewed and uncrewed.
Thank you, David. Ed, before I ask David to do this quick walk around of the aircraft, would you like to come in with regard to sort of urban environments? I'm conscious there is another Sandbox trial in which there have been some flights in an urban area. Yes,
so we've got there's huge diversity in the Sandbox projects, like there is in the UAS sector. Specifically on your question around more urban environments, we've got a couple there. So AP and Wing have been doing operations in London. So they're flying between Guy's and St Thomas's hospitals, doing delivery of blood samples, etc. So that's obviously right in the middle of an urban environment. It's quite a different risk picture to the operation David's conducting, flying over people and near some busy airspace, although relatively quiet where they're actually operating low down. Also looking to operate in urban environments, there's Amazon planning operations in Darlington, and the Lifeline project, who are looking at operating near Gatwick to deliver defibrillators. So if somebody has a heart attack, say in a park or something, they're exploring the possibility of delivering defibrillators by UAS. Thank you, Ed. It is really an exciting range of trials as well that you have underway. So David, are you happy to perhaps give us a quick show around Shield?
Yeah, sure. I'll do my best. I'll try and speak loudly so you can hear me.
Wonderful. I think our comms team have just fired me, by the way. We can hear you well, yeah, loud and clear. Yeah. Excellent.
So on the front, we have our active radar. So that's what's providing us with our recognised air picture while we're flying. MX-10 camera payload in the middle, which is the equivalent of what we're operating at the moment. on our crewed aircraft. We've got anti-collision lights and navigation lights on the aircraft. It lights up like a Christmas tree in the sky when you see it flying. And then if I come around to here, we have anti-jam GPS as well as a requirement for when we're operating. If we're thinking about future security of policing and things like that, then it's absolutely a requirement for us when we're operating. ADS-B, Mode S transponder, and Mode C transponder receiver. On the back, I don't know if you can quite see that, we've got VHF antenna. So again, that's with the VHF integrated directly into the platform itself. Then underneath, we have our C2 link, and we also have an AIS antenna as well. So because we're operating over large bodies of water, and we've got vessel movements, etc., moving around as well, although we're over the water, we still try to avoid overflight where possible, just to ensure that we are mitigating all of the risks as we possibly can. In this current configuration, when she's fueled up, we can get about 4 to 5 hours flight time out of this aircraft. And our normal sorties for testing are somewhere between 2 to 4 hours. But now we have got our aircraft shakedown testing completed and underway. We're now looking to ramp those up to 5-6 hour sorties to really see what does that look like, especially from a human factors perspective as well. So yeah, that's the Shield S100.
David, fantastic. I think you might have a job waiting for you at Shield. That was really, really insightful. Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to do that.
No problem.
Ed, talking of the trials and all of the hard work that David and peers are doing, looking ahead, how do trials like this help to shape the drone industry more generally?
Yeah, so I think of them as the pathfinders. These are the first projects that are blazing the trail that others will be able to follow. So I think that's really important to help the industry move quickly. It allows us at the CAA to work with industry. One mistake we could make is to shut ourselves away and write policy in a vacuum and then come back and say, da-da, it's ready. That doesn't work. We need to work with industry and learn. We need to understand what people's needs are. We need to understand all the equipment, its capabilities, etc. See data from the operations. So that's the key purpose for these trials. That's what we're trying to get out of them, and I think it benefits the industry as a whole.
Great stuff. Thank you, Ed. Richard, so NATS, known for provision of air traffic control to conventional aircraft. What's your vision way more broadly for drone operations in the UK as a whole?
Well, I think Ed mentioned it earlier. We've got to start from the basis that we need to integrate all users into the airspace. That's absolutely pivotal. Having lots of segregated areas of airspace adds to the complexity, and it just frankly doesn't scale for to an industrial level. And personally, as a GA pilot, I would also probably not like to have to dodge even more airspace than I do today. So that integration is really, really critical. I mean, we're seeing the demand grow very, very rapidly, particularly for more complex beyond visual line of sight operations. And I think the industry is ready to start scaling as we're able to open up the ability to operate in ways that we may not have traditionally been able to do. And that will lead on to the advanced air mobility operations later in the decade as well. I think the volume of activity and the wide variety of use cases, we've got everything from last mile delivery with APN in London, for example, using fairly small drones on a set route, to what Dave's doing with the NPAS drones at the much heavier end of the spectrum, to long range offshore missions going out to oil rigs and gas rigs and so on. The complexity of all these different use cases is quite significant. So we need to not only integrate that airspace, but to ensure we have a digital capability to handle the volume and variety of use cases to allow people to operate. We won't be able to scale the traditional air traffic control services in the same way that we will need to enable these sort of future integrated operations. So, the industry just would not be economically viable if we had to do that and use these sort of scarce voice-based skills rather than using a digital infrastructure that allows us to enable the services to operate in a different fashion.
Richard, you mentioned the breaking out of segregated airspace and the scaling effect of the industry. We know that PricewaterhouseCoopers, the management consultancy, estimate that we could see up to 900,000 drones in the UK skies by 2030. How do we move from supporting individual trials like the one we're talking about today to that fully fledged industry?
Yeah, well, I think, the nice thing with the UK in particular is that there's a clear timeline towards the policy needs that will enable us to sort of operate more routinely at scale. That's the first thing. The second thing is we're gaining experience every day, whether it be in the trials with NPAS, whether it be in what we're trying to do with Flylogix, doing offshore methane stack inspections, what we're doing with Amazon or other last mile delivery operations. That digital service is something that's really critical to be able to validate, test and prove through things like the Sandboxes here, so that we can scale the industry and do this without it being one, let's call them controller, but a digital controller of the future, being able to enable multiple services at once rather than it all being a one-to-one relationship that requires a voice over it. So a lot of different things going on there. We're already providing digital services to enable uncrewed operations at some of the NATS airports. We're working on one of the sandboxes that we're leading to open up the North Sea for commercial beyond visual line of sight operations. And we'll continue to scale up with our, with the customer demand to enable, particularly for us, the more complex beyond visual line of sight missions and the future AAM industry, rather than us focusing at the recreational light use end. So as you can appreciate, the difference in those use cases also requires a different set of capabilities and services. So you're doing 500 to 800 coffee deliveries or some last mile delivery in a day in a 2-kilometre radius is quite different to flying 14 hours offshore over 700 kilometres to do a methane stack inspection, which is also quite different to the missions Dave's carrying out and will be carrying out in the future. Our role has to be to enable all of that, and we're building the infrastructure and the capabilities to do that.
Thank you, Richard. There's a few points in there that I'm definitely going to come back to, but I'm going to cut to David, because you spoke about, Richard, service provision. And David, what does service provision from Richard's team look like for you today?
Yeah, so it's a really good point, actually. So I think what we are demonstrating quite early on within our trials is how an uncrewed aircraft operation can actually receive a basic service from an ANSP, such as NATS via Cardiff, and enable us to deconflict accordingly with other traffic. When we've been operating and we've been airborne, we've had several airspace access requests, 4 or 5 now, I think, for the period of the trial. And that's been where we've had military aircraft wanting to transit the TDA. So Cardiff will contact us via VHF. They will give us notification of a request for aircraft wanting to enter the TDA. At that time, the flight crew then will assess where our aircraft is in correlation to the surveillance picture that we see. So we have an ability to see any of the aircraft that are transponding within the area. We then will go back to Cardiff and inform them of our intent to where we're going to position the aircraft, where we're going to be holding. They will then go back to the aircraft wishing to cross. That aircraft crossing will go ahead, and that aircraft will transit the TDA. With an extra layer of safety, what we also do is the payload operator for the MX-10 camera will then track the aircraft entering and exiting the TDA. So we use the visual sensors to support our separation and deconfliction as well. And then once the aircraft has exited the TDA, they notify Cardiff, who then notify us, and then we carry on with our mission as normal. If you look at how ATC and drone operators operate today with the smaller systems, it's all by telephone. And sometimes they can use the digital systems from Altitude Angel to request access, etc. But in some cases, you are calling the ATC to request to lift via a phone. What I am seeing quite clearly is the use of the VHF being so much more efficient, and being able to talk to the ATCO controllers in the tower with the operators that I've got with their radio licenses, using the terminology that they are familiar with. It's much more swifter. There's more, I think, confidence from the ATCO side of things as well, that the person at the end of the radio knows what they're talking about and that they can receive and understand instructions as well. And I think that's a really, really valid point to highlight as we move forward, because it means then, with the evidence that we're sharing with the CAA around detect and avoid, its capability, its performance, how does the VHF perform, any issues we're having, we're feeding back with, because as Ed mentioned earlier, with other operators wanting to move forward and take on these capabilities, we can share all of our learnings and understandings from this project with other operators to help them accelerate as well.
David, it's incredible to hear just how much you've already learned in the 4 to 5 weeks you've been flying in the trial. Richard, cutting to you in terms of experience from other trials, are there any other kind of interesting key learnings that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the providing that sort of basic service and how we sort of scale in the future. I mean, Dave talked about 5 services being requested to cross or access the airspace. Our peak on a single uncrewed flight was 15 helicopter crossings during one flight in the North Sea. And so, as you can imagine, the key in the future to how we sort of scale this has got to be the ability to digitally integrate back with the uncrewed users, so that when there is a potential conflict, we can keep the uncrewed away from the crewed. And then if we still have a problem, then we've got the ability to have that acknowledgement to and from with the drone or the uncrewed operator, but also then the ability to hand control as needed back to the traditional voice operation through the air traffic control unit, so that we can keep all users safe, not just those that are connected digitally. So, 15 heli crossings during a 14-hour flight, that's it's quite a workload.
Thank you, Richard. I'm hearing a huge amount of progress across a range of trials, lots of different initiatives and lots of hard work going on. Ed, from a kind of regulatory perspective, what is it that makes beyond visual line of sight uncrewed aircraft operations such a kind of challenge? And I guess, how close are we seeing it to becoming mainstream?
Yeah, the big question that we spend our time thinking about, exactly. So I mean, fundamentally, why is BVLOS operations challenging? It's because a whole load of parts of the existing aviation system don't work when you don't have a pilot on board. That's fundamentally why it's difficult. Things like see and avoid. If you've got no one looking out of the cockpit, then see and avoid doesn't work. I think the other thing that's really important to bear in mind is BVLOS is incredibly broad. We at the CAA talk a lot about pathways, which is our way of grouping CONOPS and, crucially, sets of regulation that apply to certain operations. So if I just touch on a couple of those, one type of BVLOS operation is atypical operations, or operations in an atypical air environment. So this is typically very small UAS, might be 500 grams up to sort of 10, 15 kilos, some of them bigger, but they're operating very, very close to infrastructure. So that could be a set of pylons, that could actually also be operating low over private lands, so over fields, etc. And the approach there is that it is extremely unlikely there will be other aircraft in those locations. So actually their mitigations are around operating in areas where there aren't other aircraft, and those operations are possible today. To your question about when's this going to scale, those operations are, the CAA released CAP 3040, which sets out the policy for it. last year, and we're seeing those operations growing really quickly. And actually, if you look at the UAS sector as a whole, I think that's what many people want to do. You can do things like security, pylon inspection that way. You've then got a group of people who want to develop new aircraft, and they're often looking to operate in existing danger areas, in places where there are very few people, and the important things for them is to be able to make changes quickly to the aircraft. Again, that's really in place. We've just done a bit of work about test sites and making that easier to do. So I think that is an area that we're really seeing scaling already. The other two pathways then we've touched on a bit. So the first one is those operators who want to fly low over urban environments. So it's often last mile delivery, sometimes a bit of inspection work. With those operations through London Health Bridge, other projects like that, we're seeing the first ones beginning to happen, and I think over the next few years we're going to start to see that scale up. And then the fourth group is the one that NPAS are in, where you've got a bigger system flying at maybe a couple of 1,000 feet and actually regularly crossing paths, to Richard's point about those helicopters in the North Sea, regularly crossing paths with crewed aircraft. Similar to the low-level over urban environments, we're seeing the first operations of those. We're talking about one of them now, other ones in the North Sea, etc. And I think we're going to see over the next few years them becoming much more routine, and it being possible to do them more and more locations in the UK.
Are you receiving a deluge of requests from operators to fly?
Yes, we are. Yeah, there's lots of interest. I think if you look at the relative size of those sectors, the atypical is the biggest. That's where we're getting the most interest. But within the other ones, really healthy sectors with lots of serious players who are interested, and more people moving in all the time.
In my research for the show, I was really impressed to see just how many operators are flying in the atypical space. Is there the potential to learn between the pathways that you describe? So where you have lots of flight in atypical, can some of the lessons feed across into the other pathways?
Yes, these are as you'll appreciate, it's a continuum. It's not a hard sort of separation between these different operations. And there are definitely some things that are common across them. So if I pick a couple, C2 link security, that's important in all of the four I've talked about. There are other ones then. Detect and avoid is probably the obvious one, which is much more important in the last two pathways compared to the first two. So things in common, but also these crucial differences that mean they have different considerations as an operator and move at slightly different speeds.
Thank you, Ed. I want to turn to a slightly different topic now. So, and safety. We know that safety culture is crucial in aviation. David, what are the considerations that you've had to take into account when integrating the maintenance of your ongoing safety culture when you've been integrating new drone technologies?
Yeah, it's a really valid point. The uncrewed aircraft essentially operates with the requirements of our existing aircraft. You can't see it, but on the right to me is the maintenance schedule up on the wall for the Shield aircraft, where we do weights and balance with every time that we go to fly, with fuel loads, with payloads, etc. And when our crews make any fundamental changes to the aircraft, again, it all goes logged within the maintenance schedule regime that the Shield will have with this platform. But then when it comes to operationally as well, around like the ConOps development, etc., where we've been operating, we're actually making real-time improvements on how we're operating, because sometimes what you have on paper looks great, but actually when you come to operate and be in such a dynamic air environment, such as we are, even with the TDA, things can appear that are unexpected. You could have a technical fault in flight that you hadn't planned for. And what we've been doing is essentially evolving our ConOps whilst we've been, again, working through the last 3 or 4 weeks of flying. And for us, having that open and transparent feedback with the regulator has been really key. And I think sometimes that's somewhere culturally in the commercial space, that just culture probably isn't where it should be. But obviously, with NPAS, just culture is something we live and breathe. Safety becomes much more important than capability from that perspective. So I've kind of brought that across with our Shield operation. And within the first few weeks of us flying and testing and evaluating and doing the shakedown tests on the aircraft, it soon became apparent that the VHF testing that we'd done in Austria prior to coming to here was absolutely fine, and everything was working crystal clear. For whatever reason, when we come to the UK, we start to experience interference issues with the VHF. And it's about, okay, well, how do we manage and overcome that while still operating safely and managing comms with Cardiff? So we have a fallback process, which we drop back to the mobile phone while we're experiencing the VHF comm issues. We then had a really open and transparent conversation with the RPAS team and saying, look, we're experiencing X, Y, and Z. Can we try and do X, Y, and Z to resolve this? And a real pragmatic approach is where we came to. And then we continued flying, testing and evaluating. And I think that's something that the commercial space could learn so much from, because some people fear the regulator and they see them that as the operators are beholden to these people behind the shiny tower, right? And no offense to Ed, but there's this kind of fear that if you're open and transparent about problems within your operations, that you'll be penalised for it, and that's not the case at all. So bringing that safety just culture to this type of operation and following the due diligence that we do within NPAS has really, really been key for us. Again, we're not an operator or a technology developer that's trying to prove a piece of technology to then try and sell it. We are an organisation who has public safety at its forefront, and we are trying to evaluate a piece of technology, whether it's good, whether it's bad, to see how we can progress with that in the future. And again, being transparent about that for us is really, really key.
Fantastic answer. We are now into the closing minutes of the show. I'm going to stick with you because before, in my prep for the show, I did read all of your bios carefully. So I've got a final closing question for each of you, and I'll stick with you, David. So you describe yourself as shaping the future of air support for UK policing, and clearly we know that uncrewed aircraft, as you've demonstrated really well today, are a part of that future. But what else can we expect to see?
I think over the next 5 years, we're going to see the adoption, not just of or the potential adoption of uncrewed aircraft if the trials are successful, but additional technologies on how we would then look to scale this operationally, and how we could potentially use other pieces of technology to support policing. One of the challenges I have at the moment, and this is a really great example actually, is when my EC-135 helicopter goes to search for missing people, I have a pilot and I have a tactical flight officer in the back, and sometimes I'll have 2 tactical flight officers in the back, plus the camera payloads and the suite of sensors that comes with it. Now I'm flying an uncrewed aircraft, I only have a camera payload. I don't have the 3 pairs of eyes looking out of the helicopter for the red van or the missing person on the ground. And there's this bit of a misconception that the camera payload is what finds the missing person, when actually it's the eyes in the helicopter looking out and going, there's a person in a blue coat, is that the missing person, is that the suspect we're looking for? So my challenge is now, how do I do that with just a camera? So we're looking at technologies where we have the ability maybe to utilize artificial intelligence to look at reviewing the video feeds in real time and going, there's a red car, there's a red car, there's that person in the blue coat that you're looking for, and highlighting those points of interest. Because when we're flying with the uncrewed aircraft, there's quite a lot going on. People might think it's a lot more simpler than flying a crewed aircraft, but the intensity in the workload is probably equivocal to, if not raised higher, because all you're focusing on is instrument information coming from the ground control station and the payload. So additional tools and technology like artificial intelligence, where we can go, this element of technology can support the payload operator and help me kind of close down a little bit more on where I had 3 pairs of eyes and now a camera and now just a camera, can be a really supportive piece of technology. And this is something we're going to try and do post-trial with the video footage that we capture, is to then process it again and find, did we miss something? Could we have found that person sooner on our test and evaluation cases that we have coming up? So yeah, artificial intelligence, I think with video processing is probably a piece of technology we'd look to utilise in the future, as well as other technologies I'm sure that will come along as well.
David, thank you. It's great to hear of such cutting edge technology being used in policing. Ed, you said in your intro that you previously worked for a drone company, Flylogics. I wonder how has that helped you in your role with the CAA?
I think probably in all jobs, it's important to be able to think in your customer's shoes. And I think my experience allows me to do that and to do that more easily. If I were to give a couple of examples, obviously working at Flylogics, I went through that thing of growing a company, recruiting a team, working out your business plan, raising capital, all of those things. And a big question in that was, how long is all this going to take? And one thing we as a regulator can do to help or hinder that is the amount of visibility we give. And it was good to hear Richard talk about that in the UK we have been good at giving that visibility about what the plan is from the regulator's point of view. So that's one thing I'm sure my colleagues at the CAA will laugh when they hear me talk about this, because it's something I bring up often. But we do need to tell industry what our plan is, so that there's that clarity. And then the other one I think is, or another good example would be making sure that we make the regulations as easy and simple to understand as possible. We spend all day, every day thinking about these, and we know all the minutiae. But actually, if you're running a UAS company, David's just been talking about AI. He has to go and think about that and everything to do with his payload. He's not spending all of his time thinking about regulation. And he's probably one of the people who thinks about regulation more compared to smaller organizations, etc. So I think it's things like that. It's being able to put myself in the industry's shoes and go, 2 years ago, what would have I wanted out of the regulator, and how can we make sure we're giving that now?
Perfect. I think it's a great answer about the customer's shoes and viewpoint. Thank you, Ed. And Richard, you get the close here. So you have a career that's focused on commercializing new industries. I wonder what drew you to drones, uncrewed aircraft?
Well, yes, I've been fortunate enough to be at the leading edge of a number of industries as they've developed, whether it be creation of the mobile internet and the mobile email industry in the early days before things like iPhones were out there, to creating cyber capability to be able to lock down systems for banks and insurance companies, through to being one of the first or the pioneers of infrastructure as a service capabilities, to have dynamic volume constraints that everyone's used to with things like Azure and AWS today. I was actually in Cape Town working down there for a few months when I got a phone call back in 2018 from one of my old telco colleagues, who basically said, "You're a GA pilot, telco, how about uncrewed or drones?" And I sort of sat there and he said, at the end of the day, they're flying mobile devices, so you know what you're doing with them. And anyway, a few weeks later, that led to me ending up in Santa Monica, trying to figure out how we create and launch drone services and around the globe in partnership with a number of ANSPs. So it was interesting that the convergence of that sort of telco history with cyber, with infrastructure, and the knowledge of airspace and pilot side just came together really beautifully.
Thank you, Richard. And also nice there to highlight the global reach of this industry as well. So thank you. We are now at the close of the show. So a massive thank you to David, to Ed and to Richard. And also a huge thank you to those of you who have been watching the show. It will be available on the NATS YouTube channel and available as an audio podcast in all of our usual places. With that said, that was Altitude. Thank you and goodbye.